Hello everyone, I'm Daz and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is Andrea Nolen. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi, Des. Thank you for having me.
Now, recently, you released a book called Lincoln's Counterfeiters, I believe. I'm sure that the title's a lot longer. Sorry, would you like to tell us
Yes.
the full title?
Yes, Lincoln's Counterfeiters, and the subtitle is The Wisconsin Gang That Funded the Union and Started the Chicago Mob.
Nice. And so Andrea reached out to me, and I'm so glad that she did because I wanted to discuss this amazing topic, which is not really spoken about. Okay, we're going to start off with asking you, Andrea, what inspired you to write this book in the first place? And of course, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, what inspired me was that my hometown was the headquarters for the distribution for the counterfeit currency that this gang was putting out. And it was just a series of very fortunate coincidences that led me to research the gang and eventually write the book. So one of those coincidences, I guess, is my background. I mean, I came to the research from working in London, actually, in the financial community there. I worked as an analyst at a hedge fund there for a while. So it gave me some of the tools I needed to evaluate the information about what the counterfeiters were doing. They were counterfeiting extremely high denomination banknotes from 1857 to 1871. And during that time, high denomination banknotes, like I'm talking $100 bills, $500 bills, those were only used by other banks. So it's a very curious thing. It's a very curious set of bills for counterfeiters to be faking at that time.
Excellent. Thank you. And as you said, this is a story that's come from your hometown. So again, is that what really inspired you to bring this to light is the fact that it's your hometown?
Yes, and it kind of tied into some other interests I have, like Austro-Hungarian intelligence. During that period, Lincoln's counterfeiters later on down in Chicago, they worked with some Austro-Hungarian organized crime people. So that's another avenue that kind of drew me into it. I started recognizing names from back in Europe, so that was kind of exciting.
Okay, and again, so your hometown is Monroe's, Wisconsin.
Right. Now on this map that you have down there, it would be right at the base of Wisconsin on the border with Illinois. And that was very important for the counterfeiters because
Mhm.
they wanted a place that was sort of fuzzy legal jurisdiction, you know. So Wisconsin, Monroe fit the bill for them.
Okay, so again, is that how this small little gang in this tiny little place in Wisconsin ends up financing the Civil War?
Well, yeah, I mean that's kind of what's amazing about it because my town is very small. I mean, it still is, but the gang was actually quite large, and it had the backing of the U.S. Treasury as well as coordinated efforts between Kentucky counterfeiters, and I mean very well placed, politically connected Kentucky counterfeiters, and those working up in Michigan, which is just to the east of us in Wisconsin. So it was the a lot of very big forces kind of converged on this small little town in 1857 and brought some pretty heavy players from out east
Awesome.
into the organized crime happenings in Monroe.
Okay, so also another obviously, well, this is a city, and New York is heavily involved in counterfeiting.
Yes.
So, tell us about New York's involvement in the big business of counterfeiting at this period
Okay.
in time.
Well, unfortunately, New England, New York, Rhode Island, that whole area has been a real hotbed of counterfeiting for A very, very long time, well before the United States became a country, even. And what particularly drew New York into the Monroe counterfeiters was that the big banknote printers were there. The American Banknote Company had its head office in New York. And what these well-connected counterfeiters would do would be to partner with the engravers that worked legitimately for the American Banknote Company to, after hours, create more banknotes that were counterfeit. And so they had extremely high quality banknotes made by some very talented men, but maybe men with not very good morals, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And again, why is Abraham Lincoln turning to counterfeiters instead of bankers?
Well, the reason was that the Civil War was not popular in the North. It was especially not popular in my area. And the reason being was that we had no sound banks to issue currency that businessmen here could use. We relied on money issued by Missouri banks because they were the only trustworthy banks in the area. And of course, Missouri was part of the South. So people weren't excited about upsetting that economic boat. What Lincoln needed to do was find a way of financing his war effort and getting bankers on his side. And he did that in part through the counterfeiting and also through the National Banking Act.
Awesome. And also, so just before we move on to the next question, obviously people might know that this is the period where money is sort of and banking centralized, isn't it? So just give us a little bit of an idea of how the banking system was just before this period, because again, every state, every town had its own currency and stuff, didn't it? Or its own
Yes.
coins.
Yes, it was very factionalized, I guess you could say. And there were some places that enjoyed better banking systems than others. Missouri is one of them. And the only reason that Missouri enjoyed that was because they had honest bankers. And to be an honest banker, it means you don't print more money than your assets can reasonably justify. Okay? Unfortunately, up in our area in Chicago, everybody was a crook. Okay? The closest to a sound currency we had was actually an illegal currency issued by a Chicago insurance company run by a Scotsman. So there was this lacuna of currency that people could put their trust in. And the Missouri bankers filled that very nicely. What the national banking system is one that came in to, well, it was a wartime necessity, but it would evolve over time to centralized currency production. In DC, politicians were not happy with this sort of scattered currency being, different regions using their own currency. Often failures would have terrible economic consequences for a region. There was a push to standardize banking to minimize the risk of bank failures. And a lot of this comes later with the central bank, with the Federal Reserve System. But what Lincoln is responsible for is a sort of first federalization of the banks through the National Banking Act.
Hmm.
Um, that sort of with the victory of the Union after the war, it sort of paved the road to having a national banking system and a central bank that works the way we know it, we understand today. And this is a very good thing in some respects because it's terrible to lose your savings because a bank goes bankrupt, or because the money that you had saved under your bed is now worthless because it was inflated irresponsibly by the bankers who are printing it. Um, of course, the problem with the system you have now is that when there is mismanagement, and the Federal Reserve can mismanage the currency. When that happens, you get universal unsoundness, which is a lot bad. I mean, that's much worse than just, maybe one bank down here in Greene County, Wisconsin going under. So you see what I'm saying?
Hmm. Well, thanks for explaining that. Excellent. Yeah. And again, I was just going to ask, so what sort of countermeasures at this period in time do? Because obviously, when you get a banknote now, particularly in the US and the UK, I know other countries probably do it as well, but there's a safe a safe fail measure, within the note that tells you that this is not a fake note, so they'll put something
Right.
in there like a so. How did they do that back in that sort of period of time to stop,
Okay, yeah. Well,
or
this is
know if you had a counterfeit note or not?
right, right. Well, this is very interesting, okay, because the Monroe counterfeiters had the absolute best up-to-date technology for that because they were moonlighting for the American Bank Company, basically. What the big technology back then was using paper that was shot through with jute. So if you held the paper up to light, you could see little fibers, little black fibers in it. And there was a special way of making this paper that only the US Treasury and the American Banknote Company were supposed to know about. And of course, the Monroe counterfeiters had that technology. Their fakes were perfect because they were using the same guys who were making the real notes, right? So they had that. They also had incredibly skilled engraving for both the front and the reverse of the notes. So in fact, they often had the best counterfeiters, the best engravers that worked for the counterfeiters were actually British men, British and Welsh men, who came over and got jobs in New York. And if you get the book and like the examples you have on the screen now, you can see, I mean, the artistry of these men, it's incredible. It's breathtaking. I mean, you have to have a certain amount of skill to even attempt to fake these beautiful lines and interconnected devices that are on these notes. I mean, they're really something. They're works of art in themselves.
Oh yeah, definitely, 100%. And I mean, they still are today, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so who led this counterfeiting operation in the first?
Okay, well, it was a well-connected gang. So I'd like to break the gang up into three parts. Monroe was the distribution headquarters. And the reason we was because we had just gotten our railway line from Milwaukee, and that connected us down to Chicago. And we were in this fuzzy jurisdiction area. The guy overseeing the distribution out of Monroe was a man called Napoleon Bonaparte Latta. And he went by Bonelatta. And he was the career counterfeiter from Michigan who came in to work with the Kentucky counterfeiters out of Chicago. Um, he had been just prior to coming to Monroe and organizing all this, he had been busted in Michigan and released because he convinced the presiding judge that he was working for Alan Pinkerton. And my guess is you know about Alan Pinkerton from your Civil War research, right, Des?
Hmm.
So it's a bad look for Mr. Pinkerton. And it gets worse because this organization that Lotta set up used the Chicago railways as the key transport vector for getting these large denomination bills all over the country and even down into Mexico. And Alan Pinkerton was a security head for that railway network at that time. These counterfeiters worked for 14 years unmolested on Alan Pinkerton's railway network.
So there was some money changing hands behind these
Right.
backs.
Oh, there had to be.
Yeah.
Well, and Pinkerton's organization was staffed with a good number of smugglers already. So it was the same sort of people that the counterfeiters would be used to working with.
Hmm. And for those people that don't know, so Alan Pinkerton starts. It's like well, it's sort of like the early days of the intelligence network, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the early FBI. Yep.
Yeah, early FBI,
Or CIA,
CIA,
whichever one you
yeah,
want.
whichever one you want to say. And of course,
Yeah, yeah.
I
Uh-huh.
most famously, believe it or not, came across the Pinkertons
Yeah.
when watching Deadwood, a TV show, because they
Hmm.
mention them all the time, because they're
Oh,
in,
yeah, and they're
it's not a
another
part of the
group,
state at the time, and they're worried the Pinkertons are going to come and
right?
investigate them.
Yeah, and they're another group that I think has got off. History has been kind to the Pinkertons because, we tend to think of them as, Civil War spy masters or, police, basically doing wholesome police functions. But these guys were for hire. And in Chicago, they'd work for organized crime lords as soon as they'd work for the railway magnates or Abraham Lincoln. So they really weren't very nice guys, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I know you've sort of gone into that already, but how do they manage to make the money look so, you know,
Oh, okay.
real,
Well,
you know?
this is where the Lincoln administration comes in because while Salmon Chase was Lincoln's head of the Treasury, right? In 1857, so just before Lincoln was elected, and 3 years before Lincoln was elected and appointed Salmon Chase, he was governor of Ohio. And he sprung the guy who ran the New York section of the counterfeiting ring. He sprung this guy, Josh Miner, from jail in Ohio. Josh had been pinned for distributing fake $5 bills, and he was in jail. A couple months after he was sentenced and put in jail, he escaped. And then he was caught again a few years later, but then Chase immediately pardoned him. And as soon as Chase pardoned Miner, he went straight up to New York and started counterfeiting on the industrial scale. And those are the bills that would then get shipped to Monroe, Wisconsin, and then distributed throughout the rest of the United States.
Hmm.
So, and the British counterfeiters, the excellent British engravers that I spoke of before, it was Miner who hired them. Okay, so Miner got all the talent together to make the perfect bills, and he was the head of the gang in New York, and so he was how they were able to pull together all that specialized knowledge that they needed.
And again, so this money is obviously being fed into the economy and it's helping the union cause, isn't it? So
It
how
is.
is that actually helping the union cause
Okay,
in the
okay, and
long
this is fabulous. Okay, Abraham Lincoln got into power when Seward had sort of undermined his own political life by flip-flopping with know-nothing constituents and basically making himself unpalatable to the electorate in the Northeast. There was a lot of, I guess, behind-the-scenes machinations about who to replace Seward with, and Abraham Lincoln benefited from that. One of these behind-the-scenes characters was a guy called uh, of course I'm going to blank on his name. He ran a banknote reporting newspaper. He was the chief expert for identifying which bills were being counterfeited and which weren't. And then he'd write about it and distribute it to all his subscribers so American businessmen can know, okay, that they're trying to pass off a fake note to me because I see that it's not, according to the banknote reporter, it's not some element of the design is incorrect. Okay. And this guy is really fabulous because he was really the architect behind the national bank system. And what the national bank system was basically banks who were politically aligned, whose leadership was politically aligned behind Lincoln, who Lincoln would reward by saying, look, I'm going to issue a whole bunch of US government debt. You guys are going to get to benefit from being the first to be able to sell that debt to the public. Because, of course, that's how government debt works. They go to a bank, a government will go to a bank. They'll want to they'll want a certain amount of money. The bank will say, yes, I'll lend that to you, but then I'm going to take that loan, cut it up into a whole bunch of different pieces, and sell it on to third parties, right? So the national banks were able to benefit from selling it on to third parties before all their before all the other banks in the north. And at the same time, Lincoln severely restricted banks' ability to issue their own currency unless they were a national bank. So the national bank crew got to take over the currency issue in the North. And that's a hugely lucrative thing, right? Um, so while at the same time they're enjoying these new powers that these new privileges that banks have never enjoyed before, all based on being able to sell government debt, sell government war debt. These banks are also given the privilege of printing currency, and that privilege is taken away then from the banks who aren't clearly Lincoln supporter. You see what I'm saying? So it was a way of favoring northern banks that were politically aligned with Lincoln and disfavoring those who were, too used who wanted to keep things the way they were before the war. Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, Lincoln could never get enough money, even with all this special, friend cozying up to his friend banks. He could never get them enough money to actually pay for the war effort. I mean, he was always struggling. It's something I think the U.S. the Northern debt at the end of the war was 40 times as high as it was before the war. And these are not, that's a huge number, especially back in 1860. That's a huge factor. Um, what the counterfeiting did was allow national banks that had been irresponsible in their lending or just plain victim of the bad economic situation that the war brought about. It allowed them to get cash injections that were off the books. Okay. Okay. So it was like inflation. All right. They were allowed to benefit from inflation before all the other banks. They were allowed to spend their US dollar notes when everyone thought they were worth more than they actually were. Do you want me to talk about inflation and how
Yes,
that works?
please. Yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
Well, like as a really simplified example, let's say you're an economy. There's two apples for sale in your economy, and there's $4 circulating in the economy. We'll match those things up, and you're going to get $2 an apple, right? Those $4 chasing two apples are going to result in a price that's $2 an apple, right?
Hmm.
Kind of see where I'm going. Well, let's say now you're a national bank, and you've got these same two apples. And everybody thinks there's $4, okay? But there's really $6 or $8 or $12 in circulation. But everybody's thinking it's still only $4. Well, of course, the Apple sellers are going to still put the $2 price tag on. But those national banks who actually have 6 or 12 or $8 in their reserve, you see how they can get ahead snapping up assets?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what Lincoln was going for. And of course, then his friend banks have more assets on the book. That means they can lend him more money for his war effort. And yay, everybody's happy. Well, everybody in Lincoln's political camp is
So
happy.
again, it's a way of generating real money by
Uh-huh.
using counterfeit money. That's
Right. And basically, what you're doing is you're stealing from the apple producers, right?
right. Yeah.
That's what you're doing,
And
you
so
know?
again,
Yeah.
Lincoln knew about this and
Oh,
was okay
I
with
think
it.
he had to. I think he
Yeah.
had to because I don't think that he could have possibly appointed Chase if he didn't know about Chase's connections in the counterfeiting underworld. I don't think that the whole National Bank thing, John Thompson is the name of the National Bank reporter publisher. I don't think I mean, Lincoln put John Thompson in charge of organizing this national bank system. So there's nobody who understood counterfeiting better than John Thompson. Okay. So I don't think you could have had Thompson in there. I don't think you could have had Chase in there. I don't think these counterfeiters didn't stop with the war, by the way. They were going for 14 years. They went all the way into 71, and they couldn't have done that without huge protection. They were working with Pinkerton. They were working with Pinkerton, who was one of Lincoln's close, intelligence operatives. There's too many connections to Lincoln, in my mind, to make it even remotely possible that he didn't know. But of course, he never, wrote down, please start counterfeiting fake banknotes for me. No, no, no. This would have been like under the table, whispered in ears sort of stuff.
Yeah, you've got to do what you've got to do to win the war
Yeah.
type thing.
And he
Yeah.
had to do something because he wasn't very popular. And that war was really painful for people up here.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. Again, people seem to think that the war doesn't really affect the people living in the north, but
It was
it sort of
hell.
does, you know.
It was hell. And economically, yeah, but also the relations between people were awful. Like for instance, Bonelatta operated in New York, in Monroe here, because he had the backing of Aribert Ludlow, who owned the National Bank in our town. Okay, and Aribert Ludlow was vicious. If there was anybody who would criticize not the Union, but even criticize Lincoln, he would set thugs on him. He would send people around to hoist him up on a tie him up, hoist him up on a pole, and then march him out of town. And there was one man who even brought suit in Milwaukee after the war for violence that Aribert Ludlow's mob had done against him, and he was awarded $5,000, okay, by a northern court in Milwaukee. So Aribert Ludlow, these guys in Bonelatta, they were very bad people. They were vicious. Their ends justified their means. And they didn't stop counterfeiting when the war ended. I mean, it wasn't just about, doing what you have to do to win the war. They went on far longer. They were greedy.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. People do get greedy, and
Oh yeah, easy money.
it's never enough, is it?
No, no. And then always scared, like I got to protect myself in case somebody finds out, And of course, somebody finding out is exactly what happened in 1871.
Hmm. Okay, so again, were these men heroes or villains?
Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah,
question I have to put to you.
you can say, like you pointed out, you got to win a war. I mean, if you're willing to fight, you got to do what you need to do to win. But at the same time, these guys were counterfeiting before the war. They were counterfeiting many, many years after the war, and they were really vicious to their fellow citizens. I think that they were more villains than anything. I see very little heroism about them.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, let's talk about afterwards. So, what happens to the gang after the war?
Okay. Okay. Well, Bonelatta, right? We have our guy working with Pinkerton down in Chicago. Chicago was not an open field for organized crime. Okay. You had to pay the right people in order to have the privilege of distributing your fake banknotes. Okay. And over the course of the war, a guy called Mike McDonald became, I guess you could say, the chief crime boss in Chicago. And the reason he was able to do that was because he had the protection of something called the Kentucky Colony. And I argue that this Kentucky colony were the Kentucky counterfeiters that were run out of St. Louis in 1853. Okay. Um, these counterfeiters, these Kentucky colony men were led, it was a group of closely interconnected families that all moved from Louisville up to Chicago in 1853. They bought land plots on the outskirts of Chicago that were next to each other and built up little plantations. And that's how the colony part came to their name. And over the course of the Civil War, they really began to control politics and were the top level organized criminals in Chicago. And Mike McDonald was the guy just underneath him. He actually grew up near them on the Kentucky Colony properties. And he would make sure that their mayors, their politicians got elected so that the whole crime cycle could continue year after year. And it was these Kentucky colony people that really consolidated their control after the Civil War and eventually controlled prostitution, gambling, and, really the entire city of Chicago. It was very bad. It was Kentucky colony. It was the daughter of the Kentucky colony head, Henry Honor, who recruited her level of organization recruited Al Capone. And I'm sure everybody's heard of Al Capone, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And in Chicago, the Italian mafia gets, I think, an unfair level of blame for organized crime. But there were sort of indigenous American organized crime groups operating there for far longer than the Italians or the Austro-Hungarians or the Irish, anybody. So yeah, it's very interesting how this counterfeiting gang morphed into the Chicago mob. And bringing back to the Bonelatta connection, Bonelatta could not have distributed through Chicago if he wasn't paying off the Kentucky colony. Okay. So, oh, and one more excellent point here. In 1853, when the Kentucky counterfeiters were driven out of Louisville, they were operating the exact same pattern of counterfeiting operation that Lincoln had going out in New York. They were working with the satellite office of the American Banknote Company in Louisville, and at that time, I think it was called Rawdon, Wright, Hatch, and Edson. In a few years, so in 1853, they were working with an engraver who was working with this legitimate bill printing firm. Charles Lamb was his name. And after hours, then he'd just print more bills, sell them to the Kentucky colony, and then sell them to the Kentucky counterfeiters, and then they would distribute them, all through the South and stuff like that. So it was exactly the same setup with exactly the same company executives who changed their name then to American Banknote Company when they relocated to New York and started working with Salmon Chase's buddy out of jail. You see? So I mean it's there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. And again, I know you mentioned the Chicago mob there, but how does the story connect to the rise of the Chicago mob?
Okay. Well, Aribert Ludlow, the National Bank owner here in Monroe, was good friends with Marshall Field and Potter Palmer. Okay. Marshall Field married the daughter of Henry Honor, who was head of the Kentucky colony. Her name was Bertha Honor Palmer. And I guess, from there it's history. We had Aribert Ludlow and Bonelatta doing their counterfeiting, running the bills down to Henry Honor and Potter Palmer's territory in Chicago, and then from there distributing it all over the rest of the United States. Okay. After the Civil War, when the Kentucky Colony Organization, so again, Aribert Ludlow's counterfeiting partners, when they were consolidating their grip on Chicago, they did it mostly through working with organized gambling and prostitution. And Potter Palmer's hotel, all right, the famous Potter House in Chicago, the Palmer House in Chicago, that was the proving ground for the lords of the levee, okay? The men who the Kentucky colony would send to all the bordellos and shake them down for tax payments, all right? That's what built the Chicago mob. And the same men who took the money from the bordellos would then go on to make like gambling establishments and make more money through illegal gambling and things like that. So that was the seed of the Chicago mafia. And by the time it came to people like Al Capone, yeah, sure, prostitution was a very, very well entrenched it was huge. The red light district in Chicago was like almost a mile long, and of course there's the Palmer House Hotel up in northern State Street area, and you go straight down State Street. That's Potter Palmer developed State Street. Okay, you go straight down State Street, and then boom, you get into a huge section of that was Chicago's red light district, and it was like 3 or 4 blocks deep, both sides of State Street, and it was horrific. It was a horrific red light district, full of human trafficking. You could buy people from any part of the world down there. And by the 1890s, yes, the Italians and the Jewish mafia out of Austria-Hungarian controlled trafficking in Chicago. So, and then that's, the mob we all are familiar with from the movies, in the 1910s and 20s, right? So that's the connection, okay? It's the indigenous organized crime who originated making their money in counterfeiting, going on to, the more openly vicious things like gambling and prostitution, and using the proceeds from all that to buy up politics and eventually corrupt even national politics. So that's how you get Chicago, being the sad place it is today, really.
Awesome. Well, thanks for explaining that. So, there's a link here as well between the Wisconsin gangs, the mob,
Oh,
and the
yeah.
Sedgefield Follies. So, just explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, Arbut Ludlow's friend, Potter Palmer, he was a big, besides all this organized crime stuff, right, that his father-in-law controlled. Potter Palmer is known for developing State Street, and he was the original sponsor and landlord for Marshall Field's department store. And that was on TV not too long ago, too. I think they had a big a historical drama series. I think what was about Marshall Field, or maybe Levi Leitner, one of his subordinates or something. Anyway, another big Chicago name. Um, so yeah, so Bertha Palmer, she had this beautiful hotel. Potter Palmer gifted that Palmer House Hotel to his wife Bertha as a wedding present. Okay, so she ran the hotel that was training all the Levee Lords. She had this beautiful, opulent lifestyle, always in the newspapers, always new clothes, always dictating how Chicago society should be run, and one of the ways that she did that was sponsoring the arts. And Flo Ziegfeld's father was the beneficiary of her largesse. He set up a music school just a block away from Marshall Fields. Okay, and he would hold musical events with Austro-Hungarian musical acts, okay, the human traffickers. He would hold events like that, and Bertha would come, and her society friends would, promote them. And when the Columbian Exposition in 1893 happened, Bertha was the head of the women's delegation there, and she made sure that Flo Ziegfeld's dad was heavily promoted as like the head of music for that World's Fair. So Flo Ziegfeld, the guy we know from Ziegfeld's Follies, a sex show entrepreneur, he was riding off his father's coattails and his father's connection with the Kentucky colony. And boy, Flo Ziegfeld's dad was a interesting character because he had all sorts of connections with German and Austro-Hungarian intelligence, which fits because both the Prussians and the Austro-Hungarians were partnering with Jewish organized crime to get information on political dissidents. And quite often, this organized crime was involved with human trafficking and the organized sex trade. So, which, fit Chicago's boat. So, I mean, there's all these synergies here. And Flo Ziegfeld is just one of the many awesome American cultural contributions that we enjoy because of, Chicago.
There you go. And of course, so let's talk about the secret services again. And so,
Okay.
how do they end up betraying the criminals that they once relied on?
Okay, so just to be real clear, at this time, the Secret Service was the U.S. Treasury's law enforcement arm. And it was staffed with a lot of criminals, unfortunately, who would go after rival gangs. So at this time, the Secret Service was kind of a shady organization with a lot of skeletons in its closet. And in 1871, Lincoln's already been shot. He's out of the picture. Grant is now president, and he's rocked by a number of scandals. And everybody kind of knows something fishy is going on in Wisconsin. In Chicago, the regular police are starting to make noise about huge numbers of counterfeit bills coming down over the border. Um, Grant decides that something has to be done. So this counterfeiting gang connected to the Kentucky colony, has to be quietly wound up. Nobody important is going to go to jail, but they need to have a face to put on trial. And that face was Bonelatta, the guy who ran the distribution part of the operation here in New York. And it started, yeah, 1871. The Secret Service in Chicago sent a man up here to pose as an itinerant soap peddler and worm his way into the Bonelatta crew. And apparently that only took a couple weeks. And within that time, they had enough information to bring suit against Bonelatta. So there was a whole suddenly they had to keep everything quiet because they knew Bonelatta would run if he suspected that the Secret Service was onto him. So late one night, officials from Chicago came into town without alerting Monroe's police force, without alerting Greene County Sheriff, but with the help of Janesville's sheriff, which was the next competing town, sort of on eastward. There was a bit of a rivalry between Janesville and Monroe. So these guys come into town and suddenly nab Bonelatta at night in his bed, and they ship him off to jail in Janesville. And all hell breaks loose in Monroe because suddenly the businessmen who'd been collaborating with Bonelatta are scared that they're going to be next. So they're trying to keep a low profile. Most of them are trying to keep a low profile, except one city official and Dr. Johnson, and I can't remember what the other gentleman's position was. There were two city officials who were very close to Bonelatta. And when Bonelatta his bail had been paid for him in Janesville, and Bonelatta came back to Monroe a few days later, these two gentlemen organized the local brass band to play a triumphant fanfare as he came off the train, okay? Which I'm sure they thought was a great idea. But of course, But Ludlow and all the other counterfeiters involved were furious because they were worried now that this would, show how much support the counterfeiters had in Monroe, and that the Secret Service would extend the investigation. So there was kind of a huge amount of political fallout from that. And the best I can say is that because these counterfeiters had such good protection in Washington, the Secret Service never looked any further, but they had every reason to. And in 1872, Bonelatta went to jail for everybody. But he was pardoned a couple years later. He got a presidential pardon. I think it was Rutherford, the last Reconstruction president, pardoned him. So even Bonelatta didn't serve the full jail sentence. So there were very few, although the gang could no longer operate like it used to, there were very few actual convictions or, nobody important got burned. Let's put it that way.
Mhm. That seems to be always the way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to this previous slide, and of course, so I mean, firstly, when I found out about this, I thought a $10,000 bill. Geez,
Yeah, now these are modern, right?
right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, these
But
wouldn't have been around during the counterfeiting time.
no, but just tell us about Solomon P. Chase and why he's the face of the $10,000 bill.
Okay. Honestly, I can
Slightly
give you
helping,
no good
obviously, the
reasons why he's
counterfeiters,
the face
obviously.
of the $10,000 bill. Ignorance, maybe?
Yeah.
Historical ignorance is the reason why Salmon Chase is the head of that. Yeah, on this bill. Salmon Chase was a lawyer. Um, a lawyer down in Ohio. He married very well. He married into a landowner family who was surnamed Ludlow. I don't know if they're any relation to Arbut Ludlow. Nobody can prove where Arbut Ludlow came from. But he married very well. He married several times, and he was kind of a political animal. And he was one of these people. Now, Ohio was a place where runaway slaves might travel through to get up north. And there was a kind of cottage industry in Ohio of lawyers and human smugglers who would either help runaway slaves go northward or return them to their owners down south. And whatever happened, whether they went up north again or returned down south, whatever happened kind of depended on just who was willing to pay more money, you know? And there was a good market for former slaves up north who would work. They were kind of a way of some employers like to hire runaway slaves because they were easy to exploit, you know. Um, and of course, there were slave owners who would always pay to have runaway slaves returned because slaves were extremely valuable. It's not like modern slavery where you can, buy somebody for $30 here in the States. No, no, slaves were like tens of thousands of dollars in back then, in terms of our prices. So, slave owners were willing to sacrifice to get a slave back. And Salmon Chase was part of this network of people who would later lionize themselves as part of the Underground Railroad, but were actually opportunists. They were opportunists. They were human traffickers who would traffic people, wherever the dollars pointed. And Salmon Chase, in his writings, he talks a little bit about this and a bit about his colleagues who were involved with this, and how he would lend money to these colleagues free of interest and stuff like that. So it's really he's an interesting window on the reality of the times and the reality of what the Underground Railroad really was and what the abolitionists really were. Alan Pinkerton sort of advertised himself as a supporter of the Underground Railroad, and he did use the Chicago railways to that end, but this was part of his smuggling work. You can't, I'm sure some of these people had lofty, altruistic ideas, but the reality of the situation was this was another way to make money.
Hmm.
Um, and northern employers, especially exploitative ones who like to rely on cheap immigrant labor, like the Irish, they were always looking for new sources of labor to drive down the prices, to drive down wages. And men like Seward looked south and they saw all these, oppressed slaves and thought, wouldn't they be nice up north? And wouldn't they be cheap workers up north? Because of course these are people who are, they have no social support system once they run away. They have no way of they have fewer options for protecting themselves than people who are legally in the North. See where I'm going?
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for explaining that. And again, I know you've sort of alluded to it anyway, but just give us a little bit of the UK connection to the story.
Okay, well, it's very interesting. Of course, there are Tom Watson was the name of the chief counterfeiting engraver, and he was from an English family who had just immigrated to the United States. Apparently, he was extremely handsome. I wish I could have found a picture of him, but I couldn't. But extremely talented. Like he was the chief engraver by the time he was 20 years old. I mean, this man was incredible. So you have, and he had some Welsh helpers too, and but the core of the really talented counterfeiters came from England. What I think is maybe more telling is the English connection to the Kentucky colony. Okay, because there are people, and I'm one of them, who might say that the only country that won the U.S. Civil War was the UK.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes, after the Northern Carpetbaggers came down and bought up Southern assets cheap, ultimately it was a British investor who bought those assets. Were distressed wartime assets. A lot of Florida ended up getting bought by British investors that way. And Chicago was a huge point for British investment. I mean, the railways in Chicago are really what made the town the chief city of the Midwest. And there's strong evidence to suggest that Queen Victoria was one of the original investors in that network of railways. Um, Certainly, Prince Albert was given a tour of Chicago and the surrounding area by the head engineers for the railway. So I know that Queen Victoria's investments are not public knowledge. I can't prove what I'm saying, but given the social circumstances around Prince Albert's visit to Chicago, it's almost certain that she was, and it's kind of I don't know if that reflects very well on the royal family at that time because these railway investors were kind of a shady lot, they were part of the money behind Lincoln, and there's really little that they wouldn't do to turn a profit, and they were at the core of the sort of corrupt nexus of organized crime that the Kentucky colony got control of. So, and once Lincoln came to power, one of the first acts he put forward was an act that changed the way the railways were managed around Chicago and that area. And his cronies were given, very lucrative positions along the Pacific Railway. That was kind of Lincoln's creation. That was the prize that Chicago crime lords got for backing Lincoln. That's how they got paid. So, yeah, it's there's that connection. Bertha Palmer was very close to Prince Albert later when he, and after when he came into the throne, she was one of these kind of perennial hangers-on who would organize sex entertainments for him. I mean, she wasn't a very nice lady, and I believe the royal family didn't want anything to do with her after the king's death. She was a persona non grata, and that's when she fled down to Florida, by the way, where a good number of British investors had bought up phosphate fields and things like that. So, she has some strange. Oh, okay. Also, one more Chicago organized crime British connection. Before the Austro-Hungarian and Italian mobs took over prostitution in Chicago, the top bordellos were run by British immigrants. And the most prestigious bordello of all was the Everly Club, which was the premises was owned by a guy called Christopher Columbus Crabb, who was a British immigrant. And he may have been a serial killer too. His madams had a way of dying and leaving them all their money. And eventually the Kentucky colony had to clean that up. And they kind of pushed him in the sidelines, and they put a pair of sisters who were friends of one of the colony members. They put a pair of sisters in charge of his Everly Bordello. And that's the famous, Everly Club Bordello in Chicago.
Brilliant. No,
a lot of British connections. Not
there you
all
go. Yeah. So
flattering, but
fantastic,
yeah.
though. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. And just before we move on to our last couple of questions, I must ask,
Okay.
and again, so why is this, the counterfeiting stuff connection to Lincoln not well known and not taught in schools and not just not general knowledge?
Well, I think because it doesn't reflect well on Lincoln, and there's kind of a national maybe mythos that, Lincoln was right. He had the right ideals. He put the nation on the right track. The South were just evil, and Lincoln was good. And I think when you kind of start to understand Lincoln and the people around him, you can kind of see that these were very self-interested people who really didn't care about their neighbors very much, and whose motivation was quite a bit different than what we're told was their motivation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that.
There is, oh yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Well, I was just saying, we're very lucky in the United States because we were founded by British people, and they brought with them a lot of very excellent culture, legal institutions, and things like that. So we're very lucky. But at the same time, with those immigrants, there did come a organized crime element. And I call them the British Mafia. And that small element has been very influential. And they tend to specialize in faith-based deceptions. The Mormons, I would call, the example that everybody kind of knows about. But I think when you're looking at Lincoln and how they exploited abolitionism and dissatisfaction with slavery and kind of put it in, Christian terms, you're kind of seeing the English mafia raise its head there a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for adding that. And a little bit of fun now. So Hollywood, if you're listening,
Yeah.
or any big major, because this could, nowadays I don't think it's things are in movie or the money's in movies. I think the money's in TV shows and TV series. So now, if there was a movie or a TV series, now obviously when I turn this slide over, there is one person there, but obviously
that's exactly what I was going to say.
Well, yeah, no. So I'm just going to ask.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Daniel
thing is,
Day-Lewis is Bonelatta. Yep.
comes to mind because obviously he does play a lot of good role. He's a very good
Oh, he's
actor.
fabulous.
But I'm just saying,
Yeah.
if there was a TV show or a movie, and again,
Yeah.
Netflix, if you're listening, this is definitely a
Oh, for
movie.
sure.
All
Well,
the
Daniel
royalties go
Day-Lewis.
to Andrea, obviously, for coming up with the
Yes,
or
please.
digging into the story, not coming up with the story, but
Mhm.
just leading roles. Anybody else apart from Daniel Day-Lewis that you could think of?
Oh my goodness. Who would I have? Well, there's some interesting characters in Monroe. Like I think Elmira Humes is someone. She was a lady who had a very sad life, and my belief is that she ended up running a bordello in town. And let me see, who would I have play her? I don't know, maybe Barbara Streisand. No, but Daniel Day-Lewis is my man. He would
There you
definitely
go.
be good.
Yeah,
And
I
he's
think
British too, isn't he?
yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Awesome.
but he's a fantastic actor. I mean, everything
Oh
he
yeah.
does, he puts so much
Oh no,
belief
he's
into it. I mean, then again, he's even played Abraham Lincoln as well. So
yeah, I mean he has the in. Oh, it would be good. It would be
yeah.
good to have.
So there you go. Netflix, please contact Andrea. But
Yes,
yeah.
please.
Okay, so throughout the whole process, what was the most surprising discovery by researching this?
The Lincoln connection. I thought it was going to be bad because I knew press reports had made it clear that they were working through Chicago, and Chicago has been corrupt for so long. But to have Lincoln and then Alan Pinkerton drawn in, that was scary, kind of. That was like this is definitely a high level organized crime, and probably the sort of thing that could get you killed for talking about it, closer to the time period it happened. That was very surprising to me.
Hmm.
I
I,
didn't I
I
didn't
think I
know how
think you're
corrupt
safe
Lincoln
now, though,
was.
Andrew, aren't you?
Yeah,
You're
I
right
sure
now.
hope so.
I
Too late
think
now,
we
Dad.
both might be in trouble here, but
Yeah, right?
I hope not. I hope they're not going to send the boys around. But
Oh my goodness,
yeah,
no.
could you
Maybe
imagine?
I'm safe now because I've spoken out about it. Maybe I
There
was
you
only
go.
in danger until I published or something.
Yeah. So again, it's only recently just come out. Is that right? August, was that right?
Yeah, yeah, August 19th it came out. Yeah.
Okay. So again, where can people get hold of this fantastic book?
Okay, as far as I know, Amazon UK. Amazon UK you can order it on. I don't think it's in any of the brick and mortar bookstores in the UK, but if you have access to Amazon UK or Barnes and Noble, I don't Books a Million, all the big online retailers have it now.
Hmm.
So it shouldn't be hard to get even if you're in the UK.
Okay. And what about the US?
Oh, in the US, yes, it's pretty much everywhere. Barnes and Noble, they'll have it in brick and mortar stores. Books a Million also. If you're buying it in Chicago, Barbara's Bookstores will have it. Then the one down on State Street, I just did an event down there. Um, Most of the private book, I mean, I've been calling around, so most of the independent bookstores carry it in our area now. So if you're listening in the Chicago area, Wisconsin, Illinois, that sort of area, you can probably get it in your local bookstore.
Hmm. And how long has this been your project, and how long have you been invested in this?
It's probably from start till now, like 3 years. I was looking at other things before that were related to Arabot Ludlow and his banking endeavors. Because, actually the Ziegfeld connection pops up in Monroe again in the 1920s because Ziegfeld ran a beauty contest looking for starlet talent that a local Monroe girl just happened to win. And of course, that was totally shady, and it had connections to British intelligence, actually, Daz. So by this time, Flo Ziegfeld had his fingers in many pies. And I'd been looking at that when I stumbled across some work from a local historian called Tom Mitchell, who had done a 1871 press review of the Secret Service investigation into the Bonelatta Gang.
Awesome. And yeah, so I would like to thank you anyway for coming on
Oh,
and
sure.
telling us about
It's
Lincoln
been so fun,
Counterfeiters.
Daz. Thank you for
But
having
yeah,
me.
no, and also what you've done is you've ticked the boxes for me because I really love true crime, but obviously I really
Yeah.
love the Civil War as well. So you
Yeah.
brought the
It's
two together.
everything.
So that's fantastic. And so who doesn't like like a little bit of true crime? But yeah, so thank you so much for giving up your time and coming and talking about this. So everyone, the link to Lincoln's Counterfeiters, the Wisconsin gang that founded the union and started the mob by Andrea Nolen, is the link will be available in the podcast description. But all that is left to say as we finish up here is cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, Des.